So now I will take another approach, which is based on the famous VCG. The VCG is the abbreviation for Vickrey-Clark graphs approach, and we'll study what it means. Don't worry. So what basically has happened till now is that the mechanisms for allocation were restricted to first use one-dimensional strategy space, so that each player basically had one scalar the player had to give. We didn't assume that each player had indeed only one scalar as her strategy. It can be that the players had a much more complicated strategy. So what does it mean to have one scalar? That was basically how much you want that, how much would you like to spend on that. That's it. Now we just assume that we only allowed to communicate in one scalar, and based on the mechanism, we also allowed to use only one price for each player with the same price. There was only one scalar for each player. Now an improvement can be using the classical VCG mechanism, which we will study. So now I'm just going to tell what it is very vaguely, but we'll soon do exactly a definition because that's a classical, very important mechanism, which is used way beyond what we are doing with allocation of some bandwidth or whatever. But what it basically does is that it first needs that the entire utility function, so that you exactly is communicated, that you exactly tell how much you value each possible allocation, and that is not necessarily limited to one scalar. And the result of such a mechanism is also individual prices which you have to pay, but they may be different for each individual. Then, given those, that mechanism motivates the players to play optimum pro. In the sense, it first of all motivates the players to tell the truth, unless, or in which sense it motivates them. It is not only a Nash equilibrium, but it's a stronger thing. It's also a profile of weakly dominant strategies. So regardless what other players do, it's always at least as good for me to tell the truth as doing anything else. I don't care whether the others tell the truth. It's always at least as good for me to tell the truth, weakly better than anything else. So that's a very strong way of saying it motivates something, a strong colloquial and this profile, which indeed is shown, and I mean the allocation which is chosen if the players indeed play, which is, as I said, weakly dominant for each player. If they play this profile of each one just studying the truth, the actual evaluation function, then that also is optimal. So there is this ideal mechanism. So let's study and use that. One problem: it's too much to declare the entire utility function. So can we keep the requirement of one-dimensional mechanisms and still get the rest? So basically, in our case, not in general, in our case, inspired by VCG, we now show, not now, we will show. We just need to show what is the classical version of VCG. But inspired by that, we also show that there is a scalar strategy VCG, where the entire utility function is not necessarily communicated, only if it's scalar indeed, but what we communicate is a scalar strategy, and we still achieve efficiency, but then we indeed allow individual prices. But first, of course, we need to study what the classical VCG is, and I said it's much more important than studying this color strategy VCG, because color strategy VCG is something which we are going to use here. But the classical VCG is a classical, it's indeed a very known mechanism, which is something you definitely want to know. It's also used in many applications. In a way, it's used in eBay in another certain way. It's definitely widely used and theoretically and practically. So now we're going to first forget what we did, abstract ourselves above what we did with the allocation of resources, and talk about a very general problem. So assume that we allow quasi-linear utility to have a quasi-linear utility. So what player gets is whatever the player values some that they get, some option which is chosen, can be just added to the payment, and it's crucial that we have payment, because without payment, it can be shown that we cannot, for example, attain an optimum and a truthful. We cannot motivate players to be truthful and attain an optimum allocation. But we do assume that we have payment. And then the setting is that players in the set of I, in the set I, capital I, choose between the alternatives. One second. Yes, players in the capital set I choose between the alternatives in the capital say A alternative, and each player in I has a valuation function from A to R. Our valuation function basically given for every alternative some real number telling how much the player likes or dislikes that alternative. This can be, for example, an auction. So the alternatives, of course, they then mean who gets the sell the item, items, whatever, and then the also usually the person who gets needs to pay something. As I said, payments are required to be able to implement what they're going to implement. To be shown that without payments, we just ask players what they want and use any rule we want, it can be proven that we won't able to implement something interesting. So-called arrow theorems and Gilbert-Satterthwaite, I think that's how the surname is, theorems. So we do need to be able to charge some payments. We don't prove it here, but it can be proved. If you want, take a look at the book. I think it's chapter 9. So this can be an auction, but isn't limited to auction. But let's take an example of an auction. And that's going to be a very simple example. You'll be able to talk about that like with non-professionals, because it's really a simple thing. But we start with an example of single item, vase or whatever, or a picture, a painting, being auctioned between n players. Each player has a private value WI. That's how actually that player values get in the item. So player gets that item, wins that item, and has to pay the price P, then the utility is that item's value, actual value, which only player I knows, it's private, minus the price. And if she doesn't win, then she doesn't get anything, she doesn't pay. The utility is 0. The fact that we can express our utility as the value minus the price is indeed because we assume that this is quasi-linear. Now, in general, the options are each player can win. The player 1 wins, player 2 wins, exactly 1 player wins. These are the options. And for each player, the valuation is that if that player wins, then the actual value, the value is what the player obtains. And if that player loses, in other words, if someone else wins, any other option, then the value of that player is 0. That's the value for the item. The utility is value minus the price. The value if the player wins is WI, and otherwise it's 0. And the price if the player wins is some P, which needs to be decided upon what it is, and otherwise it's 0. So when someone else wins, I pay 0. My utility is 0. I pay 0, I get 0, pay 0, my utility is 0. When I win, my utility is WI minus P. We would like to choose someone who is a player with the maximum value. Maybe there are several, but we want to choose someone with such a value in order to optimize the social welfare, which here is defined as the total sum of the values, not the utilities, because we don't care about the payments now, but the sum of the values. However, the payments are free, so we can. I didn't mean that they are free. I mean that we are not limited with how much and what we charge. So that's the freedom of the mechanism. That's something we need to choose in order to motivate the person to tell us their value, because the obstacle is that the values are private, so people won't necessarily tell us the value. Maybe I'll tell that my value is higher than my actual value is in order to get the item. We need to decide upon the payment such that there will be no strictly profitable, at least strategic manipulation. This is what the players tell as their value, because the values originally are private. We need to choose a player with some value. And what shall we charge? So some approaches what we can charge and they don't work. So for example, what if it do not charge anything, or zero payment? Now, that's the problem, because then each player would be motivated to bid as high as possible. And since we assume that they just give any real number as their value, there is no best strategies. It's unlimited. I don't care, because what I bid is not strictly larger than what the others bid. I don't know what they bid, so it's going to be crazy. It's not something reasonable. Definitely, there is no reason to be truthful. Now, if you pay your own bid, which is often used in some auctions, that's also not a good idea, because it would demotivate declaring the actual value. For example, you would like to declare then some bid BI which is strictly smaller than the actual value, because then what you will eventually get, if you win, will be the actual value. That's how you actually value that item, minus the bid you declared. It will be something positive. If you declare exactly the bid which is equal to your value, it's going to be 0 what you get, even if you win. Because if you declare something which is strictly larger than your value, then even if you win, you will pay more than you actually value that you will lose. So you don't want to declare something which is equal or larger to your value. You want to declare something strictly smaller. How much? By how much smaller? The smallest, which still lets you win, if you can win with something smaller than your value. So the smallest, which still makes you overbid the rest. Now you don't know the others bid, so you can analyze that with the assumptions on the distributions and what others do. Maybe they do tell the truth. What shall I do? How shall I underbid and solve that? Now that's quite complicated. That's definitely not something which will make you tell the truth anyway. So what will actually work, as we now see, is the following. We need to choose the optimum. That's what we want. The mechanism chooses an option which optimizes the total value. In this case, the total value is the value of the winner. So we need to choose a player with the optimum value, a player with the optimum value. Here we are, not free. There is no freedom. I mean, now we charge the winner with the second highest bid. So the losers do not pay anything. The winner pays the maximum amount of bids above the others. Maybe there was a tie in those who win, then it actually pays the same thing that it has bid, but of course generally pays something smaller, pretty small. So the maximum between the bids of the others. That's the price. Now, why does it work? We'll now show. So the proposition, that's the famous proposition by Vickrey, that for any set of bits, you don't even care whether the others beat their true value. These are bits B. Sometimes you don't care. I still denote the bits by a kind of value, but you will see from the context when sometimes it does not have to be actually the true value elsewhere. But here I want also to emphasize that these bits do not have to be true value. Whatever bits are, of course they usually will be true value because we will make it now weekly preferable for you. It will be a weekly strategy for everyone to beat the true value, but it does not have to be. For the sake of the statement, for any bit, assume that your actual value is wi. So denote i's utility when beating the actual value wi, but the rest bit whatever, by ui, and i's utility when beating something, whatever bi, the rest keep beating b minus I, as ui prime, excuse me, that's ui of the b, we can, okay, I needed to, ui, let me see how I denote. Yeah. I want notation of the book. I wanted to make it better than in the book, and I forgot that. I'll now improve. So basically, let me explain. The book, they don't write for any bi till the end. They just write for any values, and the statement holds for any bits. So use weekly monotone, weekly dominant to tell. In this case, if I said weekly monotone, it was wrong. I meant weekly dominant. So use weekly dominant to tell your optimum bit, whatever the others do. So for any bit, the big just write for any values, and you can see that it means that whatever, whether it's true values or not. But I just wanted to make it better, to emphasize that it's for any bit. And now I forgot to define what it means u prime, but it's fine. I'll now do that. So we denote ui without anything. It seems to be like the utility of player I when she beats her true value. The rest keep beating b, whatever they beat, b of minus I. And we denote the utility of player I when she beats something else, bi. So this we denote it by ui prime, simply because that's what the book does. Not like that it's the best thing to do. And when it is the case, then beating your true value is never worse, regardless of what others do. It's never worse for you than beating something else. It's always at least as good to beat your true value. Now, why? We now prove it, but the intuition is given who wins, you pay the second best bid. I direct your attention to the fact that does not depend on you. So given who wins, which does depend on your bid, your payment does not depend on you. Whereas the fact that you win or lose does depend on your bid, but the bid which allows you winning can be only profitable if you don't bid larger than your value, because you don't want to pay eventually more than your value. So actually bidding your value allows you winning if and only if it's indeed profitable. And given who wins, you don't even influence your bid, your payment, by the choice of the payment to be the second best buy. That's the intuition. Now we just formalize it. It's actually a very simple proof. So, guys, degree by the way. So the proof is as follows. Just assume that I just look at all the possible cases. I wins when bidding the true value. If that's the case, we denote the price that I pays, the maximum between the bids of the others. So the utility of I bidding to the value is simply the true value, minus this P. Now, if I deviate it and bid something else, the I, which is greater than the star, she would still win and would pay the same because it doesn't depend. When she wins, she pays the second best price. So she would not change what the eventual utility. Now, the other possibility is deviating by bidding something which is at most star, which makes her either lose, or either lose or win and pay whatever she gets. So she will get then 0, which is definitely not more than what she used to get. She used to get something which is non-negative. Because P star, which was always not larger than WI, that is the second largest price. WI was the So no deviation from your true value can help if you used to win bidding the true value. Now, what happened if you used to lose? You making your true value makes you lose, and thereby you pay the utility of 0. If you lose, you don't get the item and you don't pay anything. Now, you're not a winner by J, so the bid of J is at least what your value is, because bidding your value, you lost. Now, one possible manipulation would be bidding something which is strictly smaller than J, or bidding something which is at least J. So if you bid something strictly smaller than J, you still keep losing, and then your utility will be 0. That's my mouse. Yeah. The utility will be 0, exactly as it used to be. You keep losing. Another manipulation, or any other manipulation, there are infinitely many, but any other manipulation would be to deviate to something which is at least what the other player bid. What the best player bid, at least be J. Then either I wins and pays the same if it's equal. Well, let's say that I wins. If she loses, keep losing, it's 0. Because I can either lose or win, it's the same, but if BI is strictly larger than BJ, then I definitely win. And then I will pay BJ, the second largest bit. And what would I obtain? You would obtain her actual utility minus what she pays, BJ. Now, since we assume that BJ was at least actual utility, it will be at most 0. Well, she has won, but it doesn't really make her happy. Not happier than what she used to be. Maybe even less happy. If she needed to beat something strictly larger than her utility, now she needs to pay strictly more than she gets. That's something which is negative. But definitely it's non-positive. So it's not better than what she used to get. So no deviation can improve what I obtains. As we said, that the intuition is that you never can win when you used to lose with telling the truth, and you can never win and be happy with that. And as long as you don't change the status, who wins, who loses, you don't change the price, and that way you don't change the utility. Now, having proven that, so it's a cool thing. So basically, we let the auctioneer, the person who organized the auction, reliably compute the maximum of those private values of self-interested players. They're interested in them winning, but in this case, you motivate them by those payments. You motivate them to tell the truth, and thereby you are able to compute the maximum. reliable in the sense that that's the best choice, or at least a best choice. Maybe there are other which are also best, but at least one of them. And this fundamentally is the implementation of, for this case, of this invisible hand of Adam Smith, that everyone, by pursuing their own utility, optimize the social good. Why? Because you pursue your own utility, and it's dominant for you, it's really dominant to tell the truth. And when you tell the truth, the mechanism optimizes the social good. So that's a way to implement that. And that's actually what mechanism design is about, usually. It's kind of a very basic case of all those problems of mechanism design. How do you make self-interesting players to do what is eventually your goal? You can have different goals, you can assume different behaviors on behalf of those players. Here you assume that they play something which is truthful if that's strictly actually, if that's at least weekly monotone for them. That's quite a reasonable assumption. And if that's the case, you're able to implement this optimum thing for the society. That's basically a typical thing we can design to motivate the participants who are acting according to some assumption, which is reasonable, hopefully. Motivate them to do something which is social or close to optimum. In this case, it's optimum. Now, from this complete case of an auction, let's go to the general case of incentive compatibility. So we want to decide upon the best option. So the mechanism is composed of some social choice we need to make based on the preference of the people, and we may force them to pay you. We may choose the monetary payment that will eventually motivate them tell you the truth, which will in turn enable you to make the choice which is optimal for the society. That's the general case. And this incentive compatibility means that it's compatible with the incentives to tell you the truth. So each player's preference is modeled by some value function from the set of options. Options can be very, very general, not only like who gets a certain item, but many, many possibilities, infinitely many things you can model with that. So there is a commonly known set of those value functions, and we denote just something about the notation. As usual, the preference vectors of the players, each one of the elements of this vector is a function, by vi till the end, and the minus I is simply the vector of preferences of all the others. So from v1 till vi minus I, and then from the I plus from v1 till vi minus 1, and then from vi plus 1 till the end. Now, the vector of such preference can be thereby denoted as vi, the preference of the I, and v minus I, so the preferences of the rest. Analogically, you can look at the set of the preference vectors, capital V, and also capital V is the strategic product of V1, V2, and so on till the end. And V minus I is the strategic product of everyone besides VI. V1 till VI minus 1. And then we don't strategically multiply by VI, but we start with VI plus 1 and till the end. So as usual, so the mechanism is social choice plus monetary payment, which are necessary, can be shown to be necessary in general to implement something. We don't show it, but it can be shown. So we need to have this possibility to charge the players. And first we notice that the procedure, what the players need to do. So how a player communicate to you what they want can be an arbitrary procedure. They can participate in some weird auction format, but we want all this to have a direct revelation mechanism, which means that the social choice function is simply a function from the set of those value functions. The players simply tell the value function to the mechanism. This is my value function. They may lie, and we want to motivate them not to lie, but they just tell the value function. There is no crazy mechanism. We assume that they just tell the value function, and then based on those value functions, there is a vector of payment function. So there is a vector of functions that for each player, based on what they all declare, all the value functions, that vector defines the payment. It's a real number, so it can be negative. If the payment is negative, it means that the player is paid by the mechanism. Now, please note that this can be proven to be not losing the generality, in the sense that you can always implement, if you can implement some weird mechanism, you can always just ask the players give you the value function and then work. Basically, the intuition is that if you can implement something with any weird mechanism, then you can just implement that with the value function simply by first taking those value functions, then simulating how the players would play the mechanism uses those value functions, and then that allows you to implement something. Then you have implement the same with the value function. I'm just telling you this non-formal, but formal just that does not limit the generality, does not limit the generality of the approach. If you look at the direct relation mechanisms, you don't prove it. So here, the direct relation mechanisms are those. And finally, we are defining what it means to be incentive compatible, or we also call it strategy proof, or we also call it truth proof. The mechanism is incentive compatible. Proof truthful, that's all same for us. If for any player and for any sets of for any bits of the other players, by the way, the book knows about their values, but again, does not have to be their true values. Any bits of the other players, we want the truth will be at least as good for the player as something else. So we know what is the choice of the mechanism. F is the choice, I remind you. When the player beats her true value, in this case, it's not like only Scalar. Generally, it can be a value function in general. When the player beats their true value function, the rest beat whatever they used to be, b minus I. And we know it is the chosen option, an optimum of A. Now, let's denote by A prime the option that would be chosen if the player beats something else, some bi. If I told my social choice function is actually my value function is some bi. The rest can do what they do. And then the mechanism is called incentive compatible if it's never worse for the player to beat the truth. So what is shown, the value of the player gets from this A, which is the option when she beats the truth, minus the payment she has to pay when she beats the truth, the rest beat as usual b minus I. That's at least as large as what the player would get from A prime minus the payment she would get when she beats bi. It's never strictly better to beat something else. It's always at least as good to beat something else as to beat the truth. That's the requirement. That's the general way of saying they want them to be incentivized to beat the truth. We don't want them to strategically lie. That's what we mean strategically. And now we suggest a mechanism which we actually implemented. Now, the social mechanism for the case of the auction of a single item, now we suggest something that generalizes that. Now, please note, as I said already, when we may not charge payment, when we just use any mechanism, but we may not charge payment, only trivial choices can be implemented in such a way. So the social choice function f can be only trivial such functions such that there is only one player who basically dictates what happens. Only trivial functions can be implemented. We cannot implement, for example, the optimum, what is here, the maximum. And the fact that only the trivial choices are incentive compatible, it's only they can be truthfully implemented is basically the result of theorems of Arrow, or theorem of the cutoff rate, or similar theorems. There is also Mueller satisfied theorem, Wheeler satisfied. Anyway, those theorems claim that we don't prove it now, but or even probably won't prove it in the course at all. We don't have time. But it's necessary to be able to charge payment. And so now we suggest such a mechanism, VCG, charges payment, and it's incentive compatible. And it optimizes the social welfare, which is the sum of the values, not the utility, because we don't care for the payments. In the goal, we just want to optimize the social welfare, the sum of the values. And the mechanism is defined generally like that. So the mechanism contains the function f and the function, and as we define general regulation mechanism, it contains f and the payment function. And it's called VCG if two conditions, if the two conditions hold. So there are two conditions. One second. Yes, the conditions are first, for any declared value functions, truth or not truth, the mechanism decides what on something which is a maximum for the sum, the value. So it optimizes social welfare, defined as the utilitarian social welfare, which means the maximum, and the sum. It maximizes the sum. So the social welfare is the sum, and it maximizes the sum. Now, the payments are defined in a generic way. Each of them will be enough for the intended compatibility, and then we choose which way sometimes because we want some other conditions to hold. Now, the generic way is as follows. There exist some functions from h1 to hn for the players, and each player has this function, which is basically a function of what the others beat. Does not depend on what the player beats. The bit here, it's not like an option. It can be an option, but generally it's a function. So the strategy of the player is what they call beat. Whatever the player tells as her value function, that's the beat. So it does not. Well, the strategy also. I choose what to tell, truth or not. So the h depends only on what the others tell. That's crucial. And for any value functions, for anything which are declared, the payment which you have to pay is this h minus the sum of the values of the others again, based on the option which has been chosen as the optimum option. Again, assuming that the values are what they have been told. Now, that's incentive compatible in the sense that I pay something which is independent of habit while receiving the total value of the others. What I mean? What I basically receive as a utility as is vi of this chosen option, f, right? Minus the payment. Now, minus that. So minus that. First of all, let's look at the second term, which we charge. Minus minus equals plus. So I receive her value of what has been chosen plus the values of everyone else. So in general, it's the sum of the values. So I receives the social welfare minus then this is HI. So I pay this HI, and together with the payment receives eventually. So I basically receive social welfare of what has been chosen minus HI. Now HI is independent of habit. What is dependent is the social welfare of what has been chosen. So Aristotle, okay, as I've already said, Aristotle utility is the social welfare of what has been chosen plus something independent of habit. Of habit, not only WI. It's the WI is the VI. What she has bit. The VI of what she has bit. Now, in order to maximize her own utility, therefore, since there is something you don't care, but what you want to maximize is what does depend perhaps on what you bid, and that's the social welfare. So each player wants to maximize the social welfare of what has been chosen. And since assuming, okay, now the social welfare assuming what the others tell is true, because maybe they lie, but you don't care. You pay here what happens if what they tell is true. So the social welfare assuming what they and you tell is true. That's what you want to maximize. So what you do have to do is just to tell the truth, because that in particular, by how the mechanism works, that in particular maximizes that. And that's a very, well, not, it's actually precise, but we want just now to write it formally. But what basically, that's actually a very similar thing to what we just said for the particular case of an auction. And we'll see actually that is a more general version of the same, of that thing. It's simply applicable much more generally than this one item auction. But to other auctions and not to non-auctions. But what that happens is that exactly like in that case, our choice, what we pay kind of is when we know what happens is not a reminder what was there. The reason it was intended compatible is that given who wins, it did not depend on our bid, how much we have to pay. Who won might depend on our bid, but in a way which we still want to be actually the truth, because it's still the best for us to tell the truth. Exactly the same happens here. There is something which does not depend on our bid, HFPI, V minus I, and what does depend is eventually this sum of what the others tell their value plus what you tell what you value, and that actually is optimum when you just beat it. Now let's formally prove that. So the theorem by Victor Clark, this is called VCG, Victor Clark Groves, is that every VCG mechanism is incentive compatible. And the proof is as follows. Given any player, I mean, basically now I've just proven it, but let's write in formulas. Given any player and any bid of the others, so I don't even care whether the others tell the truth. They eventually will, because we assume that it will prove it best, but whatever they tell. So I have some true valuation and I have valuation which I may beat something, whatever, VI. We need to prove that the player declaring VI is at least as good as declaring something else, whatever, as declaring whatever. So denote by A what is chosen by the mechanism when I declare VI. And denote by A prime to be what is chosen by the mechanism when I declare something VI. But the rest always declare B minus I, whatever they declare. Now, what I get as the utility when I declare the truth is whatever the others do. I declare the truth, I get my actual value of what has been chosen, A, and I declare the truth plus. Now minus the payment. What is the payment? Is HI minus the sum, or in other words, it's plus the sum minus HI. On the other hand, when I declare BI, which is not something, the rest keep doing what they're doing, what happens? Or how does my utility change? First of all, I still, of course, experience the value of BI, but the option which has been chosen now is AI prime, not AI, it's AI prime. And the payment now is also different because I count what the others tell. It doesn't matter what they actually feel, but what they tell they feel. But based on this other option which has been chosen, which is A prime, minus the same thing, HI, which only depends on what others do. And since the social welfare of I is the maximum possible social welfare, what I get when I just tell 1 second please is the maximum possible social welfare. These two elements of the first option are at least as large as the two elements of the second option. And the rest again does not depend on what I tell, HI of B minus C. And therefore, it's always at least as good for me to tell BI as telling BI. Whatever the others tell, true or not. But I prove that this mechanism is truthful. And the question is now how to choose HIs. Now, this HI is trivially, so one option, we can choose anything, it will still be intended compatible. But let's see what we want from the mechanism. Yeah. So what we want from the mechanism? You can choose anything, but if, for example, we choose not to it to be 0, it seems simple, but the mechanism they have to pay to the players, because I imagine the payments were this HI minus something. If that HI was 0, the payments would be basically, if the values are non-negative, it can be negative, by the way. You can talk about cases where you don't like what you have, you incur a cost for the option which is good. But if the values are positive, you don't want then to make a mechanism to have to pay to you, which would be the case if H is 0. If the values are negative, then it's fine if the mechanism pays to you for the costs you incur. If the values are positive, you don't want the mechanism to pay to you, but therefore you don't want just to make it the 0 function. So what do we then do? Let's define some requirements we might want from this mechanism. For non-negative BI, we consider the following requirement. A mechanism is ex post individually rational if the utility of the player when she beats the truth. Actually, the definition is that if everyone beats the truth, the utility of everyone is at least 0. So it's even if you can choose, go back from participating in the mechanism after that has been played off. That's why it's exposed. It's still not something you would like to do. It's individually rational. A mechanism has the second requirement is that the mechanism has no positive transfers if for any bits the payments, they can be true or not, of course, the payments are non-zero. Of course, the individual rationality is only when you beat the truth, because, as we'll see, in this case it's the auction, the one item auction was a particular case of the mechanism. So if you don't beat the truth there, let's say you beat a much larger, something which is much larger than your actual value, you can win and have to pay more than your values, and therefore you will get a zero and negative utility. It will not be individually rational. It won't be rational for you, but that's because you have not beat your true value. But if you beat a true value, it's going to be bad. It is never going to be bad. So here, actually, only your value has to be true. The others can be whatever they want. And no positive transfers also is something which we require. Sometimes it doesn't happen, sometimes it does. And we satisfy both conditions by the following. So there is a certain way to choose the payment, which is called Clark pivot payment, which satisfies both conditions. Now, the payment is the following. So what HI does declare some B minus sign is the maximum over the sum option of some choice, which maximizes not the total social welfare, but total social welfare of what the others experience. So everyone besides you. That's what you. Now, why is that good? We'll prove it's good, but let's first see what it means. Maybe we'll get some intuition about it. Though the wall payment, I remind you, it was this HI minus the sum of what has value what we have chosen. Now, for this choice of HI, the wall payment is basically the maximum. When we optimize the choice so that the players besides I get the maximum in total, minus, that's the definition of HI of minus sign Clark pivot payment. I is the pivot here, minus the maximum, and that's simply, excuse me. Not max. Okay, yeah, there is a typo. Let me fix the typo. Okay. So I fixed the typo. I hope there will be no more typos. So let's get to the proof. Yes, actually not a proof yet. Let's get. You understand the truth. So the rule is that the HI is the sum of the values of the others, but not for the choice which optimizes the total value in the beginning, but rather for the choice which optimizes the total values of the value of the others. It may be a different choice. So maybe with play I, there is one option which maximizes the total value. Now, when you look about other players, maybe there is another option. Again, look at the example of the one item auction. If I give the largest bid, with me, the best option for maximizing the total value is to give the item to me, to give it to me. Without me, actually, it will be to give it to the second highest bidder. Now, then what is the wall payment? So the wall payment is follows. I remind you that that's basically HI, minus the sum of what the players feel about A, which has been just chosen by the mechanism. And I remind you that's the difference. The mechanism chose the maximum, use the maximum for all the players, whereas the choice B is a maximum for players beside I. Now, what does it mean? How can we look at it? Basically, we look at what the sum of the other players' utility is, other players, I mean players besides I. When we look at what they could have achieved besides I, what was the maximum, minus what they achieved because of when I was actually present. basically can be seen as the damage which I inflicts upon the others intuitively. And not actually, that's what we have written, right? The difference between, I just want to show you the intuition behind the truth. And then you're going to see the proof. You see how you prove how it works, but now let's see the intuition. So that's the damage which I inflict upon the others. The difference between the optimum the others could have achieved, simply if we just cared about that, and what they actually achieved because I was there. Now I internalize this, basically the cost into externality on the outside. And the mechanism, as in our proof, is ex post individual relation. So given that we know every it's always okay, let's it means it's always better for you to tell the truth, regardless what the others tell. And there are no positive transfers, but that depends on some actually the first assumption depends. As we know proof. So let's look at the formal well first no positive transfers is something we always have. And second, so that no player has to be paid, but rather they on pay, which does not happen actually if as I told you, if you have those HI0. And that's something which is reasonable to require. Of course, not always. You don't always have to use this Clark pivot rule, but it's a nice thing to have. Now, another thing is that this individual rationality, it's always at least as good for you. Choose whether the truth is not. If your value is positive, non-negative for any option. Let's prove it. So let A be the choice of the mechanism, so it's a maximum overfunctional welfare. Pay attention, it does not matter whether the players besides you tell the truth or not. And let be the maximum of the choice which would have taken place if you were not there. You are player I. I'm kind of trying to make you feel as player I. Player I was not there. Now, when being truthful, when player I is truthful, what the utility is when she tells the truth is VI A, because that's what an A is supposed to tell. Plus minus the price. What's the price? The sum, according to the Clark pivot rule, is the sum of what the others feel when B we optimize for the others besides I, minus the sum of what they feel for A. If it's minus, I just reverse the order. So that's what happens when I is truthful, and that's the same as basically seeing that that's all I sum what I values for the choice A and what the others value according to what they tell. So it's the social welfare, sum of everything for the choice A, minus simply copying what the others feel when B is chosen, when we optimize for them. Now that's at least I can just add to this sum also the feeling of I when B is chosen, because we assume it's non-negative. In individual rationality, that's an assumption we have, and we make and have to make it, and otherwise it's not true. And finally, the whole expression is non-negative because A is chosen to optimize the sum, whereas B is chosen to optimize the sum without I. Maybe it doesn't optimize the whole sum, maybe it doesn't. So it's non-negative. The first sum is at least as large as the second one. So regardless what the others beating the truth for me always makes it non-negative. So it's individualization in that sense. And as for positive transfers, that's simple. So what are the transfers? The payments. The payments are the sum of HIs. And remember that the sum of HI is simply, excuse me, HI. HI is simply the sum of the other few. What I tell the few when we optimize for them. Pivot payment minus what they feel, the sum of what they tell you they feel when we actually choose according to the algorithm. A here, by the mechanism. And since B is optimized, B is chosen to optimize what the others feel according to what they tell. That's non-negative. So again, the no positive transfers. So the payment is always, regardless whether that's truth or not, is always non-negative if you choose the Clark pivot true. Okay, so we have proven that. That's a nice way to use this VCG. It's not the only one, but a nice way to use VCG. And now let's make a remark that we did need to assume that VI is always non-negative. And if it is negative, like it's a cost and not actually something you want to get, not gains, but a cost, then we cannot guarantee individual rationality. And now let's look at several examples which exemplify these rules of VCG and in particular of this Clark pivot rule. But first start with this example we already saw, which is single item auction. And that's simply the above example. So it's actually an example of VCG with Clark pivot rule, as now shown. Formally, the options were there. So I wins for each player I. Now, the value functions simply are how much I value winning. So it's all the possible, the value functions of player, all the possible numbers for the player winning. So when the others win, it's always 0. So those are all the possible value functions. Basically, just tell how much I value win. Here, how would we actually apply VCG with Clark pivot rule? Here we now show that exactly gives us what we did with the second price auction. Here, maximum social welfare, first of all, is indeed finding a player with the highest value. Maybe there are several such players, and every option is fine. But these are exactly the options. Finding a player with the highest value. And now, what are the payments? According to the Clark pivot rule, they are the maximum of what the others tell they value when we actually maximize for them, what the others want, minus the maximum of what they tell they value when we use 8. That's a typo. That should not be maximum. Now let me fix it. Typo so that it will not confuse you. I apologize for the typos. Now, so when I is not there, the maximum possible gain for the others is simply choosing the player with second highest bid. When I is the maximum possible gain for that is 0 because I get everything. They don't get anything. I'm talking about the value, the total value, the gain. So the Clarke pivot rule tells us that's what we should charge I. The maximum between the second highest bid. And that rule, I remind that's how the rule in general. Each player pays this thing, the maximum of what happens without him, minus what happens with him to the others when you maximize upon everything. Now we just also need to show that only the player who wins pays something. Why is that the case? Because players who don't win, they don't pay anything. Because without them, you would still get the same social maximum as we get with them. And with them, we will get the same social maximum. Because again, they don't win. It would be the same minus the same, it would be 0. So VCG with Clarke pivot rule exactly this option. Please pay attention. So the fact that we choose the best player or a best player, maybe there are several, is something which is true for every VCG. It's some kind of also natural. It was not a big deal. But the second price is actually the implication of Clarke pivot rule for this case. Another example. And the reverse option. It's procurement. So basically, you don't buy, you sell something. Or that you basically divide costs. So the bidders incur a cost by obtaining an item. Not actually you sell, but you sell. No, you don't sell. The players, I take my words back. The players don't enjoy getting the item, they pay the cost for getting it. The value is simply non-positive. So formally, the options are again, someone wins, and formally twice here, that's the type of someone wins, and the player who wins incurs some cost which is non-positive. The others just don't incur any cost. You need actually to compensate. Now we'll show what it means to have this Clarke pivot rule. You need to compensate them. Instead of charging them, you need to compensate. Now, why? First of all, choosing the lowest cost, you need to. So, how do you choose the best option? You choose the player with the lowest cost. So, with basically the largest, because they are non-positive, the largest cost, or the smallest cost in absolute value. That's what you do to maximize the social welfare. Now, what is the payment? So the paying again, the VCG payment is paying the winner. Actually, you can see this the particular case of second price auction. Paying the winner simply you pay the minus of maximum cost. Because basically you charge them. You charge the player the maximum. What happens? What is the maximum if that player is gone? And you pay what? So you, in other words, you pay them the minimum. In this case, the minus is positive. So you actually pay them something. That's you don't pay them yet anything. So that's basically what you get from direct application. Second price auction. Now that can be seen also as an application of the Clarke pivot rule, because again, if you look at the Clarke pivot rule, the payment needs to be the maximum of what others get beside me to maximize what I get together beside me. minus the maximum what they get together if you choose the option which has been chosen by the mechanism, chosen as the best for everything. And in this case, it's also the same. So what they get besides me, what is the best option, is choosing the second largest. What they get with me. What the others get with me is 0 because they don't get anything. That's the second largest. And as we said, paying this thing, which is negative, is basically being paid. The mechanism dictates us that we should charge a negative sum. In other words, it dictates that we should compensate the player, and that's reasonable. Pay attention here that we do have negative transfers, but that's reasonable. Here we do have positive transfers, negative payments. You charge them something negative, you transfer something positive. That's reasonable. Why? That's reasonable because actually, no, that's no positive transfer. Because the 1 second, please. So I get that thing, please. So that does not have to be individually rational because we don't assume non-negative values, but the positive transfer has to hold. So the transfer, the payment needs to be positive, non-negative. The payment indeed is something let me think. Okay, so I actually found a mistake. So let's go over the mistake. Let's confusing example. 1 second. Okay, so the mistake wasn't there. So this idea of charging the second worst, the second worst cost was similar to this idea of what we had in the Clark, but that's not exactly that. The rule itself is not applicable. It will actually always pay something negative. It never will make you pay negative things. That which basically means that it will never tell that you have to be paid, as is the case here. So the rule itself is similar, but it would actually not be applicable here. In the sense we can imply it, but it will not then result in that thing that we have here. The rule itself will be as follows. You have to pay the maximum what would happen to the others if you only want to maximize what they happen minus what would happen to them again if you want to maximize the whoa. Now in both cases, if you want to maximize only what happens to them, of course you need to take the guy who is not there, because then nobody of them will incur the cost, so it's going to be zero. On the other hand, if you want to optimize what happens to everyone, into the total system, again, you need to take the guy with the least cost, not there. So the sum of what those agents incur is 0. It's going to be 0. The cost of Clark pivot rule would be 0. What, however, will happen is that we are going to do something else, or at least we suggest something else. We suggest just choosing the player with the lower cost, Well, that's all this in BCG. And then we choose the payment differently. Choose the payment you pay to the winner, actually, the minus of the cost, or cost, because the values are negative, so minus of the second largest value. That's positive, that's what you pay the That's simply what we suggest. It's not a Clark pivot rule, but it kind of reminds it, because you pay the second largest. That's a thing. Well, that's not Clark. That's not that. In a second price, we've chosen the player with the largest price. Here we did the same, smallest cost, in other words, and it has to pay the cost of the second largest. This here it will be. It has to basically it gets basically paying something negative, charging the negative thing basically means so it's the second price auction. Here it's not equivalent. Unlike in the positive case, it's not equivalent to Clark pivot rule, but it reminds the idea. But here it's not equivalent to Clark pivot rule, unlike which is equivalent for non-negative. Okay, negative. The next example. Here, it's not like an auction. Simply we have a seller and a buyer, a positive seller, a positive buyer. So the seller values the item as VS, something between 0 and 1, and the buyer, the potential buyer, values the item as something else between 0 and 1, the value of buyer. These both, of course, are private values. By the way, the values are private, but the limits where they are common knowledge. And you can extend this example to any other limit, which also have to be in common knowledge. That's actually an important thing. So let's assume it's between 0 and 1, and those are private values, the seller has to be bad. The possible outcomes are either they don't trade or they do trade. And of course, the optimum is just to trade. Even the value, when the buyer values this item more than the seller, and not to trade if the buyer values the item less than the seller. Of course, when they value the item equally, it does not matter what you do, both are optimum. Now, the VCG payment now let's determine them not by the rule, but rather by forcing that no trade case will not charge any payment. What then will be the implication for the case that we do have a trade? So assume that we require that no trade does not make anyone pay. What does it mean? First of all, the VCG payments are always H of the player depending on what the other does. So the minus the sum of the values of the other players for the chosen alternative. So for the non-trade, what is going to be the seller's payment? It's going to be this H of the seller based on the value of the buyer minus the value of the buyer for the chosen alternative. So the HS of the value of the buyer minus 0, because the buyer does not value the chosen alternative. I mean, it values it for 0, because there is no trade, so the buyer does not get anything. And we require it to be equal to 0, because no trade, we require the payment to be 0. And that means that the H of the value of the buyer is going to be 0. That's the result of this assumption, of this requirement that the payments for both players. Here we just use the payment for the seller. No trade is going to be 0. The second, what happens for the buyer? For the buyer, similarly, the pay for the buyer of the no trade is H of B for the value of the seller minus the value of the, again, others, on the seller here, for the chosen alternative, no trade. Now that means basically h of b for the value of the seller minus how much does the seller values what has happened. It values the item as Vs. The value of the chosen alternative not to trade is the value of the seller of having the item is Vs. And we require again that to be 0. And from what requirements we now can calculate what will be according to this rule the payment in the case there is some trade, because that is going to be the seller is going to pay the h of s for the one of the buyer minus the value of the other person of the buyer for the chosen alternative, which is trade here, which is the h of s of vb calculated to be 0 minus the value of the buyer for the item because they traded is vb. So the seller has to pay minus vb. It means that it gets paid as expected, but not her value, but rather the value of the buyer. Now, what is the pay of the buyer? We expect it to pay, of course, not to get paid. Let's see. Pay of the buyer for the trade. It means that h of the buyer for Vs, which we know is Vs, minus the value of the seller for the chosen alternative. So it's Vs minus the value of the seller for having traded this. So now the seller doesn't have anything, it's 0. So the buyer again pays something positive, her value. Excuse me, the value of the seller. So the buyer, the assumption that when actually the buyer values the item more than the value of the seller, the buyer pays the largest, the smallest value, whereas the seller gets, it pays minus, it gets the largest value. So the mechanism needs to subsidize the trade, and this can be proven to be necessary for this such a mechanism. We don't prove it now, but it can be proven to be necessary. It's not a problem. We didn't assume the mechanism does not need to subsidize the trade, but here just notice the total payment is Vs minus Vb, which is negative. Now, the other option is multi-unit auction. Here, we have k identical bit, not 1, but k. Maybe 1, but it can be any number, which is just smaller than n, so there is not one bit for everyone. And each bidder wants exactly 1 bit. So, in this case, formally, the set of options is the set of winning coalitions. For each coalition of size k, the bidders saying that this coalition wins is an option. These are exactly the set of options. And the value of player I when coalition S wins is Vi, some Vi. In the book they say it's V star, but they assume maybe different values, so don't look at the V star, it's Vi. When player I is in the coalition, when player I wins, and 0 otherwise. I don't tell which item you win because they're identical. But the value depends whether I get an item or not. Without generality. The values Vi, V1 is at most, V2 is at most, V3 and so on till the end. So the optimum is to choose the k largest values from V and minus k plus 1 until the end. Now, what is the Clark pivot rule here? That any loser, so everyone who is smaller than minus k plus 1, pays exactly the number of the total value of the losers. If besides that guy, what will be the value? Okay, let me just take my word back. The payment in the Clark rule is that the value of everyone else, if not for that loser, since he's a loser, it will not change. It will simply be some of the values from n minus k plus 1 till n. Minus the actually some of the values which actually was realized, which is the same. So it's 0. No loser, the losers don't pay anything. Naturally enough. And any winner, so in other words, anyone who index at least n minus k plus 1, because those are the winners, pays the following. What would have been the optimum cost of the others if not for that winner? Then I would have simply start with n minus k, like one player back, and go to n, not touching that winner, minus what is the optimum cost of the others when the winner is chosen. So I simply go then from n minus k plus 1 and don't count the winner. What? I is not equal to j. It's not. It's not. Let me go to this typo. Second. I is not equal to j. So the winner basically pays the value of the next item of the next player would have won if he had one more item. Each winner that's what he plays, the next highest value. Now there are also other generalizations. We don't show them now, but there exists other generalizations. One is that each bidder may want more than I good, but then the value may not be just the same value for each other identical good, but it may be different for each obtained good. So if, for example, the goods are piece of bread, the more you get, some point to get satiated. And the more you get, the less you value it. Now, non-identical goods, that's another one, another generalization. Then you actually don't have identical goods, and moreover, the evaluations are not just the sum of the values for each one of the single goods, but that the evaluations are basically general functions, perhaps. Maybe there is some form for the function, but anyway, this domain called combinatorial options, a very important domain, quite complicated. That's not good enough. Just I show you that these generalizations exist. Not only those, of course, they generalizations include those of for many units, for many solvers. Now, the last example I think is the public. No, it's not the last. The before last example is the public project. Here we also have something which is a bit unintuitive. The government has to be taken. Is not the manager because it incurs a cost, and you want the government also to be taken into account. So here we take it as an extra agent in order to be formally within the framework of what we did. So it undertakes a project which costs C, capital C. Now each one of the n citizens values the project at some VI, maybe positive or negative. So if the government builds a road, I of course may enjoy the road to some extent, depending on how much I'm going to ride there. But I also may suffer from the road if I don't really plan to ride that road but I maybe live nearby, and there I feel that there will be more environmental maybe contamination of the environment. There will be more pollution and so on. So I may be hurt by this. So the value can be anything. So we have those citizens plus the government here are all agents. The citizens are maybe they're all agents. And the optimization of the social welfare means that the project eternally if the sum of the values is strictly larger then the cost. Or at least the cost. Well, it's exactly the cost. Sounds weird to buy something. It's not give something. Some of the values need to be still larger than the cost, so that the total value, because it's the sum of the values minus the cost, that is important. Now the Clarke pivot rule says the government needs to pay 0 if the sum of the values is greater than the cost, or if the sum of the values is negative. Why? Because what happens if the sum of the values is greater than the cost? Then without the government, I mean, without taking into account the government cost, of course, the option of choice would be to be the thing costs to get something positive. And the total value of the others, I mean, those besides the government, would be sum of the values. That's exactly the total value of those besides of the government. And we choose the best thing to build considering the government because the sum of the values is greater than C. So that's going to be 0. Well, now, if the sum of the values is strictly negative, so in total the players don't like that idea, also the government does not pay anything because without the government, if you only cared about, I mean, you can still build the thing. The options remain. When I say without the government, I don't mean that we don't use the government's services. I mean that we don't think of the government's value when considering the choice to make. So when we don't think of the government's value, we only want to optimize what happens to the players, and since the total they don't like it, we don't build anything. 0. What happens then with when we want just to optimize everything? This negative sum of the values and something which government has to spend minus C. In total negative, definitely we don't build anything, and it's again 0. So the government doesn't pay anything in this case. So if the sum of the values is in between, actually the government does have to pay something, because without the government, again, we might build something, but we don't care about the government. Since we might build something, we only care about the agents, and the sum of values is non-negative, we build that thing, and that's what we get, the sum of values. If we care about total utility, therefore, on the other hand, since the cost is at least the sum, we don't build anything, and then the total value is 0, so that's minus 0. In this case, government not only does not build anything, it also has to pay the users. That's a weird mechanism. Now, as for the citizens, I pays negative if she isn't pivotal, and if she is pivotal, she pays something. Now, what does it mean, pivotal? Pivotal means being a citizen without which there will be nothing, and with that thing, there is something. Or the other way around. So a citizen who changes the picture. Maybe there are several, maybe every citizen is pivotal. If you have 2 citizens, the total cost, for example, the value of everyone is 1, and the government cost is 1.5. Then the sum of the values is 2, 1 plus 1 is greater than the government cost, so they do build this thing together. But without one of them, the value does not exceed the necessary value of the government. And each one of them is a pivotal system. So pivotal is not necessarily that at some point they have a change. It's defined regardless of order. If besides you, people are not enough to build, or on the other hand, if they are enough, but you have a negative value, which actually makes them not enough. So, if the player is not pivotal, either besides you they are not enough, and with you they are enough, or the other way around, without you they want to build, but you are negative and decrease that. Now, if the citizen is not pivotal, it doesn't pay anything, because what the others do without the citizen is exactly the same as what the others do with the citizen, because she is not pivotal. And therefore, the total utility of the others, that has been the citizen and the citizens and the government, the total utility is exactly the same, regardless whether we think of the citizen as something we also need to take into account when optimizing, so the system doesn't pay anything. Now, if she's pivotal, the first case, when she's positive, the value is positive, what does she pay? She pays what is the total utility of the others with me. So when they, when I want only to make something which is better for them, without me they don't like this idea. Without me, I just count the citizens and the government. Without me, they prefer not to build anything, and therefore it's going to be 0. With me, they prefer to build that, and that's going to be the total values minus C, but total values of others. And that's what I pay. If she's pivotal with a negative value, then again, without her, the players would actually build something. That's the case. So that's what's going to be the total value, the other players. Now, with her, they wouldn't beat anything already, and therefore the total value is going to be negative, 0. That's what she pays. Okay. Now we can also show, we don't show it now, but we can show that the total payment is always from the citizen doesn't ever cover the S, the C. So unless of course this kind of edge case, when it's exactly the C, the sum of the values, the total payment of citizens does not cover C. So the mechanism again needs to subsidize the trade. And as before, as we mentioned before, this can be shown to be inevitable. And for one example, that we want to buy a path in the network. Now, given a direct graph, we assume that we want to. Okay, first of all, the players are those who own edges. Okay, this basically identify edges with the player. So each edge is owned by another player. So identify edges with the player. And we utilize the edge. If you utilize the edge, it costs the player some positive or negative cost. So in other words, the player gets the utility of minus this cost. If the decision is going to undertake, utilizes the edge. Otherwise, the player does not incur any cost. So, what do we need to do to choose here? Given 2 nodes, we need to buy an ST path, and player E obtains, again, players are identified with the edges, obtains the value of 0 if she is not on the path, and minus the cost, negative value, she incurs the cost, if she is on the path. So, of course, the players don't want to be on the path, and the BCG will just hold fast the path that minimizes the sum of the costs. Now, what are going to be the payments according to the following requirement? We don't start with the pivot rule. We just tell that we require, as like a decision, as a constraint, that the players who are not on the path won't pay anything. What can we immediately conclude? Because we want to conclude something which will allow us then to tell what the players who are on the path. So the place not in the path will pay not anything. That means that being not in the path, your payment is the HE based on the values of the others minus the sum of the values of the others of the chosen path. So the sum of the values of the others of the chosen path, basically, what are the values of the others of the chosen path? Okay, that's HE minus the sum of the values of the minus cost of all the others of all the edges besides E on this path. Since E is not in the path, it is simply all the edges on the path. And we require it to be 0. So HE of Pi is equal to this minus sum of the costs of all those who are on the path. Now, therefore, we conclude that an edge which is on the path, let's denote it by 0, have to pay, again, what? HE 0 of the other values minus what the other edges, how much they value the chosen alternative this path. What does that mean? What is HE of this? We know that it is the minus of the sum of the cost so we have shown that the HE of V minus I is the minus of the sum of the cost of the edges of a path, which is a best path, not including this edge. We assume it to exist. So we assume this connectivity. Now, okay, so yeah, now each edge on the path has to pay h of this edge minus the sum of the value of all the other edges on the which are not in the chosen option. Now, h of this, we know that it's simply the sum of the costs of the edge on the best path, not on that edge. That's what we found. That's now the sum of the cost minus sum of the cost on the best path, not on the edge. You know, this divided by p prime, and we assume such a path exists. So it's like two path, two edge connected. Assume it exists, and minus the values of the other edges for that path. Now, basically, we just need to go again over the path. Besides that, we just E0, excuse me. We count all those costs as minus, and that's the values. So basically, we have charged each such edge the cost of all the other edge on the best path, on the cheapest path, minus the cost of all the edges on the second cheapest path. And for the best, excuse me, not on the second cheapest path, but on the cheapest path besides that E0. Now, in other words, we can say that each E0 is, well, this is always negative. Excuse me, yes. Why? Because we look at all the edges. In both cases, we look at the all the edges which don't include a 0. Once we already started with a path which is the cheapest, and we also did need something 0. In the other case, we just look among some subset of the paths of the cheapest path. We don't delete anything. So this is a negative thing. So we basically charge that negative thing, or in other words, we just say that we pay minus that. That's what we pay basically to everyone who is on the path. Everyone who has to stay in the path we've chosen gets paid there. And That's a result of the assumption that those who are not in the pub don't pay anything. Now, that's therefore not an assumption of the pivot rule, Clarke pivot rule, but that's in the spirit of that rule. You pay that the others besides you would have been minus what the others have to pay when you look at all the players of all the possible parts. That's in the speed. Okay. So we have taken a look at several examples of PCG, something with the Clarke to something without, but usually it was in the spirit of that rule. But it was always a VCG, so it was always optimum and scientific compatible. Now, the next thing we are going to do is look at this thing which is in the spirit of VCG, but requires less communication. You don't communicate more than just scalar for your value function. But in our case, it will still be enough to do what we want. Now we're going to go back to this resource allocation and get inspired from this VCG. But now the VCG and all that, that's extremely important. That's basically the central theory of mechanism design. So that's actually more important than what we are going to do now. So the lecture of today is probably much more important.